She never raised her voice. Not once in 3 years. The men in that compound thought silence meant she had nothing to say. They were wrong. She had everything to say. She just wasn't saying it to them. Her name, as far as anyone in that valley knew, was Diepka. She cooked. She scrubbed pots with sand when the water ran low. She kept her eyes down and her hands busy, and nobody, not the guards, not the couriers, not the man they called the foreman, ever once asked where she'd learned to move a knife that fast, or why she never flinched at gunfire in the hills. They didn't know her real name. They didn't know she'd once flown Black Hawks out of Bagram before Langley came knocking. They didn't know the radio in the corner of the kitchen, the one she claimed was broken, hadn't been broken in months. They were about to find out. But not yet. Before we go further, comment where you're tuning in from, hit that subscribe button, and drop a like if you want more of these. Now, let's go back 3 years, to the night she first walked into that compound with a bag of rice and a name that wasn't hers. The compound sat in a fold of dry mountains where the wind never stopped and the dust got into everything: food, weapons, lungs. It smelled of diesel, scorched bread, and gun oil, a combination she'd stopped noticing around month 4. 3 years earlier, she'd walked in through the eastern gate with a cousin's forged papers and a story about a dead husband. Nobody checked too closely. Women who cooked and stayed quiet weren't worth the effort of checking. She kept a locked tin under a loose floor tile. Not weapons, not papers. A single dog tag, scratched illegible on purpose, and a photograph so worn she didn't need to look at it to know it was her father, still in his flight suit, still smiling like nothing in the world could touch him. She touched the tin most nights, never opened it. That would come later. The kitchen was her post and her cover both. From it, she could see the motor pool, the radio shack, and the goat path the couriers used when they didn't want to be seen on the main road. She cataloged all of it. Every face, every new crate, every changed patrol schedule, sent out in fragments, hidden in things nobody would ever search. A hollow ladle handle, a seam in a flour sack. Nobody in that compound had ever asked her real name. That was about to change, but the compound didn't know it yet. The foreman ran the compound's daily business: food, fuel, discipline. He'd taken to calling her Old Woman, though she wasn't yet 30, because she didn't laugh at his jokes and didn't lower her eyes fast enough for his taste. "You burn the bread again. I feed you to the dogs," he told her once, loud enough for the yard to hear, and the yard had laughed. She'd only nodded, wiped her hands on her apron, said nothing. What she thought and never said was that she'd once talked a wounded door gunner through applying his own tourniquet over a radio full of static and incoming fire, and that a man who thought burnt bread was worth threats didn't understand what real stakes looked like. She had a scar along her left forearm, thin and pale, that she kept covered with her sleeve. When anyone asked, rarely, because nobody looked at her long enough to ask, she said it was from a cooking accident. It was not from a cooking accident. That scar had a story. The story had a name attached to it. The name wasn't Yasmin. Somewhere 200 miles east, in a windowless room with too much coffee and not enough sleep, a man named Nathan Carter checked a secure feed for the 4th time that hour, waiting on a signal that hadn't come in 9 days. Nathan Carter had run her file since the beginning. He knew her real name, her real service record, the real reason Langley had pulled her out of a covert extraction unit and asked her to disappear into a kitchen in the mountains instead of cockpit. He also knew 9 days of silence from an asset embedded that deep wasn't unusual. It also wasn't nothing. "She's fine," he told his supervisor, more to convince himself than her. "She's gone dark before." His supervisor didn't answer right away. On the desk between them sat a folder marked with a single word instead of a name, the only name that mattered in that building: Marigold. 3 years of Marigold's reporting had mapped that compound down to the number of steps between the water tank and the ammunition stores. 3 years of patience nobody outside that room would ever know about, let alone thank her for. Back at the compound, the radio in the kitchen corner crackled once, faintly, at 0300, a sound so small only someone listening for it would catch it. She was listening for it. She always was. She didn't move from where she lay. Just opened her eyes in the dark and waited for the second click that would tell her whether the strike was still 48 hours out or whether everything had just changed. The second click never came. Instead, at 0314, every light in the compound died at once. Not a rolling brownout, not a fuel problem. A clean, total blackout. Generators, radios, the perimeter floodlights, all of it gone in the same half-second, like someone had reached out and simply switched the whole place off. Men were shouting before she'd even sat up. Boots pounded past the kitchen door. Somewhere near the motor pool, someone was trying to start a generator that wasn't going to start. Not tonight. She lay still a moment longer than she needed to, listening to the panic build in the dark, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She knew exactly why the compound had gone dark. She'd spent 4 months making sure it would, the day this happened, in exactly this way. The foreman's voice cut through the chaos outside, sharp with something she'd never heard from him before. Not command, not confidence, uncertainty. "Cook," he barked, shoving open her door without knocking, a flashlight beam cutting across her face. "Get up. Something's wrong." She sat up slowly, letting her eyes adjust, letting him see exactly nothing on her face. "Yes," she said quietly. "Something's wrong." She just didn't tell him what. Outside, the compound had become a maze of shouting men and swinging flashlight beams. The foreman grabbed 2 guards and barked orders that made no sense in the dark. Check the fence, check the gate, check the radios that weren't going to answer. She followed at a distance, apron still on, moving the way she always moved, unhurried, unnoticed, invisible in plain sight. It was a skill nobody had taught her on purpose. It was a skill that had kept her alive. At the radio shack, a young courier named Malik was slapping the side of the transmitter like that might fix it. "Dead," he said. "All of it. Even the backup." The foreman rounded on him. "Backup doesn't die on its own." Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever looked at her long enough to wonder why the woman who cooked their meals had once spent a semester of her old life studying electrical countermeasures, or why she'd spent the last 4 months quietly rewiring conduit nobody thought to guard. She'd busied herself lighting a lantern, hands steady, movements small and practical, exactly the kind of thing a frightened cook would do. Her mind was doing something else entirely. Counting. 48 hours had become something much shorter. The blackout wasn't supposed to happen yet. Something had moved the timeline up, and she didn't know why. By the time the sun rose gray and reluctant over the ridgeline, the compound had the look of a place that knew, on some animal level, that it was being watched. The foreman had every man he trusted posted at the walls. He hadn't slept. His jaw was tight in a way she recognized. Not fear exactly, but the particular tension of a man who suspects a threat he can't name. She brought him tea, the way she always did, and set it down without a word. "You're not scared," he said suddenly, studying her over the rim of the cup. It wasn't a question. "Should I be? Everyone else is." She shrugged, wiped her hands on her apron, the same gesture she'd used 100 times to end a conversation before it started. "I've seen worse mornings." He didn't answer that, but something in his eyes shifted. Not suspicion yet, not quite. Just the first faint itch of a question he didn't have words for. 200 miles east, Nathan Carter stared at a blank feed and made a decision that would either save her life or end it. "Move the window up," he told the room. "Now, before they figure out what they're looking at." Nobody argued with him. Nobody ever did, when his voice went that flat and quiet. The order to move up the extraction window didn't come without a cost. It meant a strike team was crossing terrain they hadn't fully mapped, on a timeline that hadn't been rehearsed, based on 9 days of silence and 1 blacked-out compound. It meant trusting an asset they hadn't heard from in over a week to still be exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly who she was supposed to be. "If she's compromised," his supervisor said quietly, "we're sending 6 men into a trap." "She's not compromised," Nathan said. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "I know her." That was the whole argument. And it was enough because in 3 years Marigold had never once missed a signal, never once sent a false report, never once given him a reason to doubt the calm certainty in every fragment of intelligence she smuggled out in a hollow spoon handle or a seam of burlap. Back at the compound, she was doing the only thing she could do now that the timeline had shifted under her, waiting and watching and cooking rice for men who had no idea the ground beneath them had already started to move. The foreman found her again at midday, this time without the tea as an excuse. "Yasmin," he said, "walk with me." It wasn't a request. They walked the perimeter road together, past the motor pool, past the water tank, past the exact spot she'd mapped and reported 100 times over. He didn't speak for a long while. When he did, his voice had lost its usual bark. "The blackout," he said. "Same night the backup radio died. Same night the schedule for the North Patrol got moved without anyone remembering who moved it." She kept her eyes on the road. "Bad luck comes in threes. My grandmother used to say that." "Your grandmother." He said it like he was testing the word, turning it over. "You've never mentioned a grandmother. You've never asked." He stopped walking. For the first time in 3 years, he actually looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way you look at something you just realized you never properly saw. "Who are you?" he said. Not a threat yet. Something closer to unease. She met his eyes and let the silence stretch a beat too long before she answered. Long enough that the not answering said more than any answer could have. "I'm the woman who cooks your rice," she said finally. He didn't believe her. She could see it settle into his face. But he had no proof, no name, nothing to hang suspicion on. Only the itch, and the itch wasn't enough. Not yet. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark with the tin under the floor tile pressed flat beneath her palm through the boards, listening to the compound breathe around her. A cough here, a shifted rifle there. The particular silence of men trying too hard to seem calm. Somewhere past midnight, she heard it. Not a radio click this time. Boots. Soft ones, moving wrong for a patrol. Moving with a rhythm she recognized in her bones because she trained men to move exactly that way herself. They were close. Closer than the 48-hour window should have allowed. Closer than even a moved-up timeline accounted for. Something had gone wrong, or something had gone exactly right. And from inside the kitchen with a knife she used for onions, she had no way of knowing which. She rose without a sound, slipped the tin from beneath the tile, and for the first time in 3 years, opened it. The dog tag inside caught what little light there was. She didn't need to read it. She'd had the letters memorized since the day they stopped being letters and started being the only thing left of who she used to be. Outside, a single low whistle cut through the dark. 2 notes, rising, then falling. She closed her hand around the tag and finally, quietly, smiled. The whistle meant one thing only. The strike team was in position, and the countdown had already started whether the compound knew it or not. She moved fast now, no longer bothering with the slow, unhurried gait of a frightened cook. Down the hallway, past the sleeping quarters, she counted doors the way she counted them every night for 3 years. Habit turned to instinct, instinct turned to certainty. The foreman's door was the third on the left. She didn't open it. Not yet. Her job tonight wasn't confrontation. It was making sure the compound's own defenses turned against itself in the next 4 minutes. The fuel line she'd rerouted months ago, the ammunition store she'd mismarked crate by crate so the wrong men would reach for the wrong boxes in the dark. A shout went up near the east wall. Then another. Then the unmistakable stutter of gunfire, controlled and precise. Nothing like the panicked burst she'd heard from the compound's own guards 100 times before. The strike team was in. She flattened herself against the kitchen wall as boots thundered past outside, and for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to feel something other than calculation. Not fear, relief, sharp and sudden, like surfacing after too long underwater. It didn't last. A hand closed around her wrist in the dark, and it wasn't a soldier's hand. "You knew," the foreman said, his voice low and shaking with something between fury and disbelief. He'd found her exactly where she shouldn't have been, near the ammunition store, tin still clenched in her other fist, dog tag catching the strobe of distant gunfire. You knew this was coming. She didn't try to pull free. Struggling would have told him more than words ever could. "I told you," she said, calm even now, especially now. "I've seen worse mornings." His grip tightened. Outside, the gunfire was closer, moving room to room with a discipline that made her chest ache with something like pride. For minutes, maybe less, before this hallway stopped being his and started being someone else's. "Say your name," he said. "Your real one." For 3 years, she'd never once told the truth in that compound. Not her name, not her past, not the sound of her own voice when it wasn't performing, quiet and small and harmless. Somewhere close, too close, a second whistle sounded. 3 notes this time, urgent, a signal she recognized as clearly as her own heartbeat. She looked the foreman dead in the eye, and for the first time in 3 years, let him see exactly who had been standing in his kitchen the whole time. "Captain," she said. "Captain Emily Doyle, United States Air Force. And you're out of time." The name hit him like a physical blow, not because he recognized it, but because of how she said it. Flat, certain, utterly without fear, in a voice that had spent 3 years pretending to have none. Before he could process it, before his hand could tighten further or reach for the pistol at his hip, the hallway wall behind him buckled inward in a controlled breach that threw dust and light and noise into the space all at once. 2 operators moved through the gap with the kind of economy that only came from thousands of hours of training. Check the corners, check the threat, check the asset. Marigold, one of them called, voice cutting clean through the chaos. "Confirm status." She didn't answer immediately. Her wrist was still caught in the foreman's grip, his face gone slack with a disbelief that hadn't yet curdled into rage. "Confirmed," she said finally, eyes still locked on the man who'd called her old woman for 3 years and never once wondered why she never flinched at gunfire in the hills. "Asset secure. Target for extraction, negative." "He stays." The foreman's grip finally loosened, not from choice, but from the particular paralysis of a man realizing, far too late, exactly what he'd had walking his halls the entire time. "You," he said, the word barely a whisper now. "You were never just a cook." "No," Emily said. "I never was." The operators moved her back through the breach with practiced efficiency, one covering the hallway while the other kept pace at her shoulder, murmuring updates into a comms unit she hadn't heard active radio traffic on in 3 years. It felt strange, almost too loud, after so long living inside careful silence. 6 minutes to extraction point, the lead operator said. "You good to move, ma'am?" Mung. Nobody had called her that in 3 years either. She almost laughed. "I'm good," she said, and meant it, though her legs remembered how to run faster than her mind had caught up to the fact that she was allowed to. Behind them, the compound was falling in careful, surgical pieces, not the chaos she'd expected after 3 years of quietly cataloging its weaknesses, but something closer to inevitability, each breach and each capture landing exactly where her reporting had said it would. Months of hollow spoon handles and mismarked crates and rerouted fuel lines, all of it converging in this one 4-minute window she'd spent 3 years building toward without ever knowing the exact night it would arrive. At the extraction point, a helicopter idled low and dark against the ridgeline, rotors beating a rhythm into the cold air that she felt in her chest before she consciously registered the sound. She hadn't heard that sound in 3 years either. It hit her harder than she expected. She climbed aboard without needing help, dropped into the jump seat with the automatic economy of someone who'd done this 100 times in a different life, and only then let her hands finally, quietly shake. Across from her, a man she hadn't seen in 3 years leaned into the fading light of the cabin, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Nathan," she said finally, over the rotor noise. "Captain." Nathan Carter's voice cracked slightly on the word, the only sign of 9 sleepless days catching up all at once. "You had us worried?" "I had myself worried," she admitted. "The blackout wasn't supposed to happen for 2 more days. We know. We moved the window when you went dark." She let that settle. The fact that 6 men had crossed unmapped terrain on a timeline built entirely on trust in her silence, not her signal. It sat heavier than she expected, heavier than 3 years of danger ever had. The helicopter banked east, the compound shrinking below into a scatter of lights and shouting and men who would spend a long time trying to understand what had actually happened to them that night. She didn't look back at it. She'd spent 3 years memorizing every inch of that place. She didn't need to see it again to know she'd never forget it. The debrief facility smelled nothing like the compound. No diesel, no scorched bread, just recycled air and fluorescent light that felt almost violently clean after 3 years of dust. Emily sat across a metal table from two analysts she'd never met, answering questions in the same flat, controlled voice she'd used to hide behind for so long that unhiding felt like relearning a language. "Walk us through the blackout," one of them said. "Start to finish." She did. The conduit rerouted over 4 months, disguised as kitchen repairs nobody thought worth questioning. The backup radio she'd quietly sabotaged the week prior, the timing built to buy the strike team a window nobody inside that compound would ever see coming. Nathan watched from the corner of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing, though she caught him more than once shaking his head slightly at some detail she'd folded in so casually it barely registered as extraordinary. "You did all of that," the analyst said slowly, with a ladle and a floor tile. "And 3 years," Emily said. "Don't forget the 3 years." Nobody in that room laughed, though something in the way they looked at her afterward had shifted. Not disbelief anymore, but the particular quiet that came from finally understanding the size of what they'd been reading in her reports the whole time. It was 2 days before anyone remembered to ask her the question underneath all the others. Not what she'd done, but how she'd survived doing it for 3 straight years without a single mistake. Nathan finally asked it over coffee, the first real conversation they'd had that wasn't procedure. "How do you keep it up that long?" Not the tradecraft, the waiting. Emily turned her cup slowly, considering. "You learn to disappear into the part," she said. "Not act it. Live it." The cook wasn't a costume, Nathan. "Some days she was more real to me than I was." "That's not healthy." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She didn't elaborate further, and he didn't push because both of them understood something the analysts in that debrief room hadn't quite grasped, that the hardest technical skill she'd used in that compound wasn't the wiring or the codes or the timing. It was the discipline of being underestimated for 3 years without ever once correcting anyone, without ever once needing them to know. She thought of the foreman's face in that last moment, the disbelief curdling into something almost like grief for the 3 years he'd spent not seeing her. She didn't feel sorry for him. She just understood, finally, exactly how well she'd done her job. The formal review took place a week later, in a room with no windows and a flag she hadn't stood in front of in 3 years. Her service dress hung strange on her shoulders after so long in coveralls and headscarves, stiff, unfamiliar, like armor she'd forgotten how to wear. A colonel she'd never met, a man named Frank Bishop, read the operation summary aloud in the flat, procedural tone reserved for things too significant to editorialize. Single-source intelligence, sustained over 38 months, resulted in the successful location and neutralization of a high-value logistics network, the recovery of 2 hostages, and the capture of 4 senior operatives, without loss of American life. He looked up from the page. "Captain Doyle, anything to add for the record?" The room waited. Nathan waited. Even the colonel, despite 30 years of reading dry reports aloud, seemed to be waiting for something more than procedure. Emily thought of the ladle, the floor tile, the rice she'd learned to cook well enough that no one ever once suspected the woman making it had spent a decade before that flying men out of places just as dangerous, at speeds and stakes none of them in that quiet room could fully picture. "No, sir," she said, "just doing the job." Bishop studied her a moment longer than protocol required, the way people had started doing since the compound, like they were trying to reconcile the calm, unremarkable woman in front of them with 38 months of intelligence that had rewritten an entire regional threat assessment. "You understand," he said, "what you did in there. Most operators don't last 6 months under that kind of exposure. You did 3 years." "I had good cover," Emily said. Nobody questions the cook. A few people in the room actually smiled at that, the first lightness the review had allowed itself. Bishop didn't, not quite, but something in his posture eased. "There's a commendation being drafted," he said. "Classified, obviously. It won't mean much outside this room." "That's fine," Emily said, and meant it. She hadn't done any of it for a room, or a commendation, or a folder that would sit sealed in a vault for the next 50 years. She'd done it because 6 men had trusted her silence enough to move an extraction window on 9 days of nothing. And because somewhere in that compound, 2 hostages had been counting days they didn't know were almost over. "Dismissed, Captain," Bishop said. And for the first time in 3 years, the word felt like it was actually meant for her. Outside the review room, Nathan caught up with her in the hallway, jacket over one arm, looking like a man who hadn't fully exhaled in over a week. "You did good in there," he said. "I told the truth. That's not the same as doing good." "With you," he said, "it usually is." She almost smiled at that, the closest either of them had come to acknowledging what 3 years of silent trust between a handler and an asset actually cost, on both ends of the wire. "What happens to him?" she asked. "The foreman." Nathan's face went carefully neutral, the look of a man choosing words for someone who'd earned the right to ask and still couldn't have everything, facing a long list of things. "He'll answer for it." She nodded slowly and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't need to know more than that. 3 years of cataloging a man's every weakness hadn't left her with hatred for him. Just a kind of tired clarity, the understanding that some people built cages without ever noticing they'd built one for themselves too. "Go home, Captain," Nathan said. Actual home this time. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't entirely sure, after 3 years of being someone else, what that word even meant to her anymore. Home, it turned out, was a small house outside Boise that her sister Grace had kept exactly as she'd left it 3 years ago. Same chipped mug in the cabinet, same photo of their father in his flight suit propped on the mantel, the twin of the worn one she'd carried folded in a tin under a floor tile for 38 months. Grace hugged her at the door for a long time without asking a single question, because the paperwork Emily had signed on her way out of the debrief meant there weren't any answers Grace was allowed to have, and Grace, God bless her, had never once pushed. "You look tired," Grace said finally, pulling back to study her sister's face. "I am tired," Emily admitted, and it was the first fully honest thing she'd said to a civilian in 3 years, and it felt strange and good in equal measure. That night she slept 9 hours straight for the first time since before the compound, and woke disoriented by the silence. No boots in a hallway to count, no radio to listen for 0300, no floor tile to check. Just quiet. Actual quiet, not performed quiet. It took her a full week to stop reaching for a knife every time a door opened without warning. 3 months later, Nathan found her exactly where he expected to. Not behind a desk, not in a briefing room, but in a hangar at a small regional airfield outside Boise, elbow deep in the guts of a Cessna's engine, grease up to her wrists. "You're supposed to be resting," he said from the doorway. "This is resting." She didn't look up from the carburetor. "You should try it sometime." He watched her work for a moment. The same economy of motion she'd used cooking rice for 3 years now turned toward something that was actually hers. A local flight instructor had hired her without asking many questions, charmed by a resume that mentioned rotary wing hours and conveniently omitted the last 3 years entirely. "There's an offer on the table," Nathan said. "Training command. They want your read on the next generation of deep cover assets." "I know. I got the letter." And she finally straightened, wiping her hands on a rag, and gave him a look he recognized from a hallway in a compound 3 months and half a world away. The look of someone who'd already made her decision and was deciding whether he'd earned an explanation. "Tell them I'm thinking about it," she said. "Tell them I'm not in a hurry anymore." What Nathan didn't push on, and what Emily didn't say out loud, was that 3 years of being underestimated had left her with something she hadn't expected to keep, a genuine, uncomplicated love for the quiet, unglamorous work of fixing engines with her hands, work nobody watched and nobody graded and nobody needed her to disappear inside of. The flight students at the little airfield had no idea their unassuming instructor's assistant had once talked a strike team through a blackout timeline from inside enemy territory. They just knew she was patient, precise, and never rattled. Not by a stalled engine, not by a nervous first-timer white-knuckling the yoke, not by anything. One afternoon, an older man came in asking about lessons for his granddaughter and paused at the sight of Emily's forearm as she reached for a wrench, the thin, pale scar catching the hangar light. "Cooking accident," she said, before he could ask. an old reflex she hadn't quite shaken. He nodded, not really listening, already distracted by his granddaughter tugging his sleeve toward the planes. Emily watched them go and let herself smile, small and private, at how easily the lie still worked. Some things, she was learning, you kept not because you needed to hide anymore, but because they'd become part of how you carried the years that came before. The commendation ceremony, when it finally happened, took place in a room with no cameras, no press, and exactly 11 people in it. The smallest audience Emily had ever performed for, and the only one that had ever actually known what she'd done. Colonel Bishop pinned the medal himself, murmuring something about 38 months and quiet courage that she only half heard, focused instead on Nathan standing near the back wall, arms crossed, looking prouder than she'd ever seen him allow himself to look. Afterward, in the parking lot, an unexpected face was waiting by her car. The strike team's lead operator from that night, a broad-shouldered man named Chris Reynolds, who she'd exchanged maybe 40 words with in the chaos of the extraction. Wanted to shake the hand, he said simply, of the only asset I've ever heard of who blacked out a whole compound with a ladle. She shook his hand and found she didn't mind, for once, being seen for exactly what she'd done. Anytime you need someone who doesn't panic, he added, half joking, you know where to find me. I'm retired, Emily said. He grinned. Sure you are. 6 months out, Emily still woke some nights at 0300 out of pure habit, listening for a click that never came, before remembering, with a small private relief, that she didn't have to listen for anything anymore. She kept the tin, kept the dog tag inside it, no longer scratched illegible in her mind, even though the metal itself stayed worn past reading. She didn't need it legible. She'd carried those letters long enough to know them by heart. The foreman's trial concluded quietly, the details classified, the outcome exactly what 38 months of patient reporting had made sure it would be. She didn't attend. She didn't need to see his face again to know she'd already won whatever there was to win, on a night 4 minutes long that took 3 years to build. Most mornings now, she's at the hangar before the sun's fully up, hands in an engine, coffee going cold on the workbench, exactly as unremarkable as she always wanted people to think she was. Except now it's true. If this story hit home, drop a like and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her position, 3 years in, waiting for a signal that might never come? And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. There's always another hidden hero out there.